There was a moment early in his rise when the suggestion came, calm and calculated. If you want to truly go global, you should consider recording in English. It wasn't said aggressively. It wasn't even framed as pressure. It was positioned as opportunity, expansion, access. For decades, that had been the path. International artists who wanted mainstream American dominance eventually adapted. They translated themselves, they softened their accents, they reshaped their identities to fit the largest market in the world. That was the silent contract of global fame. Benito Martínez listened carefully, and then he did nothing. No English album, no crossover rebrand, no strategic bilingual compromise. He continued creating entirely in Spanish. At the time, it didn't look revolutionary. It looked risky. It looked stubborn. It looked like someone refusing to play the game properly. But what appeared to be defiance was actually something far more calculated. It was recalibration. To understand that decision, you have to understand where he came from. Puerto Rico is not just an island. It is a layered identity. It is a territory caught between cultures, influenced by the United States yet fiercely protective of its own voice. Spanish there is not just language. It is pride. It is memory. It is belonging. It is resistance without shouting. When Bad Bunny sings in Spanish, he is not simply choosing words that rhyme. He is choosing cultural alignment. He is choosing not to dilute the emotional frequency of where he comes from. For years, the music industry operated on a simple hierarchy. English was the gateway. If you wanted to dominate the Billboard charts, if you wanted Grammy visibility, if you wanted global press cycles, you adapted linguistically. Spanish language artists were often placed in separate categories: Latin charts, Latin awards, Latin playlists. The implication was subtle but clear. This is important, but it is not central. It is celebrated, but it is not dominant. Bad Bunny entered that system and refused to step sideways. He didn't aim for crossover, he aimed for takeover. Streaming platforms changed everything. Algorithms do not care about language. They care about engagement. They care about repeat listens. They care about emotional intensity. When people feel something, they press play again. They share. They obsess. And obsession doesn't require translation. Emotion moves faster than vocabulary. His voice carried melancholy, confidence, vulnerability, and defiance all at once. Listeners who didn't understand every lyric still felt the energy. They felt the rhythm. They felt authenticity. And authenticity scales. When his albums began topping global charts without a single English pivot, the industry had to adjust its assumptions. When El Último Tour del Mundo debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, fully in Spanish, it shattered a psychological ceiling. It wasn't just a chart achievement, it was structural disruption. It proved that English was no longer a requirement for dominance. It proved that the global audience was more open than executives had assumed. It proved that cultural specificity could outperform forced universality. But this was never just about charts. It was about power. For decades, artists from non-English speaking backgrounds were encouraged to translate themselves in order to be accepted. That translation often came at a cost. Cultural nuance gets flattened, slang loses depth, emotion becomes simplified. Bad Bunny understood that the way you express heartbreak in Spanish is not interchangeable with English. The rhythm changes, the tone shifts, the soul of the sentence transforms. He wasn't interested in approximations. He wanted precision. There were risks. The industry always warns of ceilings. What if mainstream America eventually loses interest? What if radio support becomes limited? What if you are boxed into a niche category forever? Compromise would have been easy. One bilingual album, a few English hooks strategically placed, a symbolic gesture toward accessibility. But compromise would have signaled something else. It would have suggested that the original form wasn't enough. And that suggestion would have weakened the entire movement. His refusal wasn't loud. He didn't condemn English music. He didn't criticize artists who chose crossover paths. He simply continued being himself. Consistency became rebellion. By staying rooted, he created gravity. Instead of crossing over, the world crossed toward him. At Coachella, thousands of fans screamed Spanish lyrics fluently. In Europe, crowds memorized entire verses without translation. In the United States, Spanish-language albums outsold English pop projects. The center shifted. There is a deeper psychological dimension here. When you stop chasing validation from the dominant culture, you gain leverage over it. When you no longer seek entry into rooms, rooms begin adjusting their doors. Power is often defined by what you refuse to need. Bad Bunny did not need to sing in English to prove global relevance. That absence became his strength. Younger artists watched closely. In Brazil, Nigeria, Korea, Colombia, Spain, and countless other regions, creators saw something transformative. You do not have to erase yourself to succeed. You do not have to flatten your accent. You do not have to dilute your identity. Authenticity is not a barrier to scale. It is the engine of scale. The more rooted you are, the more universal you become. That paradox changed the next generation. There is also branding intelligence behind the decision. In an era of oversaturation, uniqueness is currency. If everyone adapts to the same formula, individuality disappears. By staying Spanish first, Bad Bunny built a distinct global identity. He became a symbol, not just an artist. A representation of cultural sovereignty in a market that historically rewarded assimilation. Could he release an English album tomorrow and dominate? Probably. Would it break streaming records? Very likely. But that's not the point. The point is that he never needed to. Power is defined by optionality. When something is optional rather than necessary, it becomes a choice rather than a compromise. The global music landscape looks different now. Spanish-language songs routinely top charts. Latin artists collaborate without apology. International hits no longer require translation to be legitimized. The psychological barrier has weakened. And while many factors contributed to that shift, his refusal played a central role. What appeared to be stubbornness was strategy. What looked like limitation was leverage. By refusing to translate himself, he forced the industry to translate its expectations. He didn't shrink to fit the world. He expanded until the world adjusted around him. Language was never the obstacle. It was the amplifier. Spanish carried rhythm, intimacy, regional texture. It carried history. It carried pride. He chose to protect that texture instead of sanding it down for convenience. And that protection became dominance. In the end, the story isn't about rejecting English. It is about rejecting the assumption that success requires surrender. It is about understanding that authenticity, when amplified consistently, becomes unstoppable. It is about realizing that the future of global music is multilingual by default, not by exception. The kid from Vega Baja who once stocked shelves under fluorescent lights did not set out to rewrite the rules of international music. But by staying rooted in his language, he did exactly that. He didn't translate himself, he amplified himself. And in that amplification, he changed what global means forever.